Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. And this is our last video for the visible and the invisible. Finishing up this chapter, the intertwining, the chiasm. And there's a lot to get through today, so I think we'll just jump straight into it. Most of what we're going to talk about today is what Merleau-Ponty calls pure ideality. And it's just like it's more conceptual, abstract ideas. He also calls these ideas of the intelligence. So it's that rather than the ideas we looked at in the last video, which were kind of connected closely to the sensible and the visible, the ideas we're going to talk about mainly in this video are more abstract, more conceptual than that. So the first part of the video is just called ideas. Basically here all I want to do is recap a little bit of what we talked about in the last video and just finish up a couple of points regarding what ideas are. So first up, in the last video we called ideas the invisible opaque zone around the clear zones, which are the flesh. In other words, the intersection of the sensing and the sensible, the touching and the touched. Those ideas, what they did, their purpose, their goal was to structure, was to provide, a quote from the last video, the lining and the depth for the visibles which appear in those clearings. And I just want to build on that a little bit and talk about the idea as structure with a quote. With the first vision, the first contact, there is not the positing of a content, but the opening of a dimension that can never again be closed, the establishment of a level in terms of which every other experience will henceforth be situated. The idea is this level, this dimension. So the first vision here is the opening of the clearing, using words that we talked about in the last video. And it doesn't go straight to positing a content, a visible, a thing. Rather, it is simply the opening of a dimension, a zone, a clearing, within which a content will appear. Or, as Merleau-Ponty also says, the establishment of a level. Again, we can think of this as like setting up the frame or the structure upon which a content will appear. And this dimension, this level, this structuring aspect is precisely the idea. And the other thing that comes out of that quote is the way that, or the kind of, I guess, a consequence we can draw from that quote is that the idea, as we've been talking about it so far, is closely connected to the world. So the invisible idea has an intimate bond with the visible object. The idea is the invisible of this world, and which inhabits this world, sustains it, and renders it visible, its own and interior possibility, the being of this being. So the idea is not a transcendent, detached, kind of capital I idea, but an idea bound to the world, bound to the visible, as that which inhabits the world, which sustains the things in it, which renders them visible. It's the possibility of this world. As Merleau-Ponty says, the being, the capital B being of this small b being. And that's all kind of just going over some of the things that we talked about in the last video. There's one last point here before we move on, and it's this notion of Merleau-Ponty talks about ideas possessing us. So he says we don't possess ideas when they're understood in this way, which is how we usually think of it, right? We think of my ideas as mine. I'm the owner of those ideas. But that way of thinking is already a derivative notion for Merleau-Ponty, because if you think about it, what are you talking about when you say that? You're talking about you as a self, as an individual, as a subject, appearing over and above the idea, which is therefore an object. So we're back into that subject-object dichotomy, which, as we've seen, is derivative, and it's, while not wrong, it's an abstraction of the more primary, originary truth, ontological truth. So we normally think, my ideas are mine, I own my ideas, we possess our ideas, they are objects which we control, which we make, which we produce. But actually, there's a real sense in which it's the opposite here. Our ideas possess us in a way, because our ideas, the ideas, not my ideas actually, ideas structure the visibles for me. They structure my world. And this, you can see how this kind of leads into the postmodernist vein of thought. But again, like whether we like that or don't like it, there's a truth there. To think of my ideas as mine, as if I were the creator and the owner of them, the sole creator, the sole originator of these ideas, is too short-sighted. There's a whole history that's gone on prior to me adopting these ideas. And it's not a history that I had any part in, that I had any say in. So it's just flipping things on its head a little bit and getting us to, you can take that postmodernist path, which has value actually, more than I would have thought, more than I would have acknowledged a couple of years ago. But we can also see this from an ontological perspective, in which case to think of me as the possessor of my ideas is an abstraction. It's a derivative notion, because originally, ontologically, the ideas structure things for me. They structure the world around me. And that's interesting. So the second part of the video, and I think this is the last, I divided it into two, but the second part is massive. So it's strict versus pure ideality. So strict ideality essentially is the notion of ideas that we've been talking about up until this point. So I'll give you a quote and we'll break that down. There is a strict ideality in experiences that are experiences of the flesh. The moments of the sonata, the fragments of the luminous field, adhere to one another with a cohesion without a concept, which is of the same type as the cohesion of the parts of my body, or the cohesion of my body with the world. Is my body a thing? Is it an idea? It is neither, being the measurement of the things. We will therefore have to recognize an ideality that is not alien to the flesh, that gives it its axes, its depth, its dimensions. So strict ideality then refers to the idea as the invisible, the opaque zone around the sensible objects, the sensible object or objects. And the idea appears through the sensible because the sensible is structured by it. And this is, as I noted, as I said before, this is exactly what we've been talking about, what I talked about all in the last video and so far in this video. So the way strict ideality works is it enables the sensibles, the moments, i.e. the notes of the sonata, Swann's little phrase that we talked about, or the fragments of the luminous field, the moments of lighting, to cohere without a concept. And by this, Merleau-Ponty means the way that these moments kind of naturally, effortlessly fit together, in the sense that they don't require any kind of intellectual act of synthesis. There's no cognizing, there's no cognition taking place in order to bring these elements together. They cohere like the parts of my body. You don't need to, or I don't need to think about my body in order to use it. It's something that happens naturally. It literally precedes thought. I use my body without having to think. And it's exactly the same with the way that sensibles, the way that visibles cohere through these ideas, these structuring ideas, but without the need for explicit conceptualization. They naturally form the structure or the framework which produces, which guides, which determines the sensibles as the things that they are. So my body then, returning to the notion of my body is neither thing nor idea, rather it's the measurement of things. We've talked about that before, the way my body lets things appear. And ideas do the same thing. They structure flesh by giving it its axes, its depth, its dimensions, such that this means that ideas cannot be alien to flesh. Rather, they are, as we said at the beginning, they're intimately connected to it. They only appear through it, and they structure what those sensibles are. And remember, flesh, when I talk about flesh here, it's not physical. It's not the same as saying materiality or physicality here. Rather, flesh is that hinge between the flesh of the world, touched, and the flesh of my body, as sensible for itself or touching. And the point is that the ideas and the flesh described here are related to the sensible, to the little phrase of music, to the lighting, etc. So ideas structure flesh, which structures the visible and allows it to appear in the clearing. And that's basically a kind of summary of what we talked about in the last video, and it's exactly what strict ideality is. Strict ideality, in a word, ideas as they relate to the sensible. And this then sets the stage for a move to pure ideality. So pure ideality, what can we say about this? So how can I start? Merleau-Ponty says, once we enter this strange domain in which the body and vision are tangled up in one another, i.e. this world of strict ideality, how can we ever leave it? He says, how do we get to the ideas of the intelligence? And it's these ideas that Merleau-Ponty calls pure ideality. How do we get from strict ideality, once we're there, how do we somehow get out of that into this other domain, if you like, of pure ideality? And he says he's not going to answer this fully just yet, but he does say quite a bit about it, actually. That's what the rest of this video is about. But he starts off by noting that these ideas, pure though they are, as abstract and as apparently divorced from the sensible as they are, they're still connected to the body and to the world. They're still connected to sensibility, in other words. The pure ideality already streams forth along the articulations of the aesthesiological body, along the contours of the sensible things. It is too soon now to clarify this type of surpassing that does not leave its field of origin. Let us only say that the pure ideality is itself not without flesh, nor freed from horizon structures. It lives of them, though they be another flesh and other horizons. It is as though the visibility that animates the sensible world were to emigrate, not outside of every body, but into another less heavy, more transparent body, as though it were to change flesh, abandoning the flesh of the body for that of language, and thereby would be emancipated, but not freed from every condition. Okay, cool. So perhaps I should just note what we're talking about with pure ideality. I called it ideas of the intelligence, but I didn't really go into any more depth than that. What he's talking about is things like, I guess, abstract concepts that have no sensible counterpart or no sensible correlation. So mathematics is a good one. Someone commented in the last video about quantum mechanics and abstract mathematics, where there is nothing sensible anymore. You've completely left the realm of the sensible. And that's what we're talking about here with pure ideality. But Merleau-Ponty says this pure ideality, these ideas of the intelligence, are not divorced from sensing and the sensible. Rather, pure ideality streams forth along the articulations of the aesthesiological body, along the contours of the sensible things. Nice expression first, but what we want to know is how. How is it connected in this way to the aesthesiological body, to the contours of the sensible things? And he says it's too early to clarify this, but there seem to me to be two aspects to this. The first is that pure ideality still requires flesh, just a different kind of flesh. So although mathematics is abstract, it has no apparent connection to the sensible, it still requires that same structure that we've identified in flesh. Why? Because that is exactly how sense or meaning is generated in Merleau-Ponty's ontology. In strict ideality, it was the sense of the visible, the sensible, and it was generated in the flesh of the body and the world. In pure ideality, it's the sense of the conceptual, and it's generated in the flesh, not of the body and the world, but in the flesh of symbols, or, as Merleau-Ponty says in that quote, in the flesh of language. And I use the word symbols just because I think it's more general, but language, when you think of literally language, words, grammar, that's a kind of flesh. Another kind of language is mathematics. It's just another form of language. And that's the flesh that pure ideality adopts. So it retains that same structure, that same flesh structure. Because remember, flesh it's not restricted to the material. It's certainly nothing to do with physical bodies, right? So although strict ideality dealt with the sensible through a flesh of the body and the world, pure ideality deals with the conceptual, but also through a flesh, but a flesh of symbols. Thus, Merleau-Ponty says it's as if the visibility we've been talking about emigrates not outside of the sensible flesh of the body and the world, but just into a less heavy, more transparent flesh, that of language. So that's the first point, the first reason why I think there is this connection between ideas as they relate to the sensible and ideas as they relate to more abstract, less tangible, less visible notions. And the second aspect that I see in this, insofar as it connects it back to the sensible, is that, and Merleau-Ponty doesn't explicitly say this, but I think it's there. It's not just that pure ideality has the same structure, this flesh structure. Rather, it's that it requires the flesh of the body and world, because this is primary. This is originary. We must be anchored in the world first before we can proceed to these heights of abstraction that we're talking about now, through math, through physics and those kinds of things, through language, concepts. So when we're engaged in conceptual thinking, when we're engaged in mathematical reasoning, what do? We read texts, we read books physically, right? Sensibly. We discuss ideas with other people. We speak, we listen. We're engaged in the sensible world. We write our thoughts down. Again, in the sensible, with using physical objects. We are fully 100% geared into the world, the sensible, even though we are discussing, when we're thinking about abstract ideas or notions which have little to do with anything sensible, which can't even be experienced in any kind of sensible way. Everything we do, whether we're engaged in, whether we're talking about strict ideality or pure ideality, is replete with the sensible. And in that sense, it's foundational. It's the ground, and everything that comes on top of that must be built on top of it. It doesn't become anything. It never loses that touch, that connection back to the sensible. If it did, it would no longer be relevant or meaningful or interesting. In summary of that quote, in moving from strict to pure ideality, ideas themselves don't change. They're conceptual in both cases, right? We talked about Swann's little phrase. The idea behind that was the essence of love. And we're talking here about more other concepts, other ideas, like, I guess if you're thinking about philosophy, the idea would be something like flesh. If you're thinking about science, physics, maybe it'll be something like gravity or quantum entanglement. Those are concepts just as conceptual as the one we looked at regarding strict ideality, the essence of love, when we were looking at that piece of music. So ideas don't change, rather flesh changes. However, although flesh changes, it's still flesh, just less heavy, more transparent. It retains its original structure, plus this less heavy flesh of language or symbols still depends on its sensible predecessor. So it can only operate within a sensible framework. And it has therefore been emancipated, Merleau-Ponty says, but not freed from every sensible condition. It's still tethered to the sensible. It still has its roots in the sensible, and it's not just that it has its roots in there and it's kind of left them behind. Everything that we do with regards to these ideas is carried out through the sensible. It's the one constant that we can never get away from. Okay, so what else can we say about sense or ideas in strict and pure ideality? Well, first up, I have a quote for you. Language as well as music can sustain a sense by virtue of its own arrangement, catch a meaning in its mesh. Just as the musical notation is a facsimile made after the event, an abstract portrait of the musical entity, language as a system of explicit relations between signs and signified, sounds and meaning, is a result and a product of the operative language in which sense and sound are in the same relationship as the little phrase and the 5 notes found in it afterwards. So basically what I want to do with this is contrast ideas in strict ideality and impure ideality, as Merleau-Ponty's portraying them here. So in strict ideality first, we've got musical notes, which are, if you like, the raw sound, the sensible parts, and they comprise the little phrase, which is the sensible whole. And this is structured by the essence of love, which is the sense or the meaning or the idea. Musical notation is the abstract portrait which we can construct to organize this occurrence, this appearing, this audible, if you like. So this musical notation is the system of explicit relations between signs and signified, sounds and meaning. So that's strict ideality. If we turn to look at pure ideality then, I can say almost exactly, I'll keep the frame exactly the same and just plug in or change some of the terms in there to move us from strict to pure ideality. So words or numbers, these are the raw sounds or the raw visibles, if you're talking about words on a piece of paper, which comprise the sentence or the equation, which is the sensible whole. And that sentence or equation is structured by the concept. For example, gravity or superposition or flesh was another one that I used. And these, or the concept, is the sense or the meaning or the idea behind that sensible whole, the sentence or the equation. Language in this, language or mathematics, so not actual words, not actual numbers, but the formal system of language or mathematics, is the abstract portrait. In other words, it's the system of explicit relations between signs and signified, or sounds and meaning. So that's the parallel, if you like, the comparison between strict ideality and pure ideality. I'm going to put up a little diagram in a moment because it may be hard to kind of track the parallels between those two just from me speaking, but I'll throw that up once I get to the end of this section. Another thing that's important to note from that quote was the emphasis of the whole over the parts, although there's not a huge emphasis placed on it, but it is there. So the actual notes appear in the little phrase, Merleau-Ponty says, afterwards. And the same can be said for words in a sentence. The words themselves appear after we have taken on the sentence as a whole. After we've heard the idea behind the sentence, then we can break it up into individual words. In both of these cases, the point is that the whole is prior to the parts, and the parts are secondary abstractions. And therefore, while they're essential in a kind of nuts and bolts fashion, they're not essential to ontology. So it might be worth just thinking about that for a moment. We've talked about this a lot before in phenomenology in particular, and we talked about it, I'm sure, in phenomenology of perception and in any other phenomenologist that we've looked at. But the notes in that phrase, that little phrase of music, they appear after we have heard the phrase itself. And like I said, the words, the individual words in a sentence, we hear those specific words, particular words, after we grasp the sentence itself. It's the whole which is apprehended first. But of course, without the parts, without the notes, without the words, you wouldn't have the whole. You wouldn't have that piece of music or that sentence. That's obviously true. But this is not how we understand. It's not how meaning appears in the world. And this is the exact opposite of how science approaches things, right? Because it's the opposite of how we typically think of things. We imagine, we approach these things with a kind of assembly mindset. We think everything has to be assembled from pieces. So the pieces are fundamental. And although that's true in a fairly, like I said, a nuts and bolts fashion, they're not essential when it comes to understanding anything, when it comes to meaning or ideas, nor are they essential when it comes to how we experience the world. And they're certainly not essential in an ontological sense. My analogy for this is bricks in a building. So think about a building, it's made of bricks, but what's important for you in any meaningful sense of that word, if you're just looking at the building, if you want to live in a building, if you want to understand a building, what's important is not the bricks. What's important is other features, right? Other things about the building. What a building is, it's more than just the bricks. If I give you a description of every brick that goes into a building, that's not going to tell you anything about the building. There's more to it than that. There's more to a building than just the bricks. And it's the same here. There's more to the essence of love in that song, in those notes, than just the notes themselves. The notes themselves, taken on their own, won't tell you anything about the essence of love. It's only when they appear in such a way that the individual notes disappear that the meaning, the sense, the idea behind those notes becomes apparent. And that's a real, phenomenological theme. But it comes out here on the ontology as well, because we're engaged in a similar process here. We're trying to understand being itself over the individual beings themselves. And in order to do that, we have to direct our attention to the whole rather than the parts. So there's another quote which adds to this and builds on it as well. And in a sense, to understand a phrase is nothing else than to fully welcome it in its sonorous being, or, as we put it so well, to hear what it says. The meaning is not on the phrase like the butter on the bread, like a second layer of psychic reality spread over the sound. It is the totality of what is said, the integral of all the differentiations of the verbal chain. It is given with the words for those who have ears to hear. So again, wholes over parts. The meaning of a phrase is in the totality of what is said, the integral of all of the differentiations of the verbal chain. It's grasped, in other words, by hearing it as a whole in a single go, as it were, rather than having to piece the whole together from all of its parts. Like I said, that's the opposite of how we typically tend to think of it, especially in our modern scientific age, where everything is, we approach things in the complete opposite direction. Anything to be understood has to be understood from the bottom up. In order to understand it fully, we try and break things up and look at all of their component pieces. And as I've said about 1,000 times in about 100 different videos, breaking something apart doesn't get you to an explanation of the thing that you're breaking apart, because that thing no longer exists. The little pieces, if you can put all the little pieces, if you can see all the little pieces of a thing, you don't see the thing anymore. You don't get the thing. When you try and put them back together, you get something different than the original thing you started with. Fine. And another good example of this is the way we think of consciousness. We try and understand consciousness as being assembled from discrete qualia, as if the way that we understand, the way that we our consciousness operates is, I don't know, like a computer, right? It just takes in all of these discrete data and then assembles an image or a sound or something like that. And that is the exact opposite of how I think we have to understand consciousness. Anyway, that's going in a different direction. But this is very similar to what, just to link to another philosopher, Heidegger, what Heidegger says, what he calls hearkening. In Being and Time, he talks about the way we hear the whole before we hear the individual tones or notes that make up that whole. I forget the example he uses, probably a sentence, in which case we hear the meaning of the sentence before the individual words. In order to understand the meaning, in order to understand what is said, we can't focus on the individual words, because if we focus on the individual words, we lose that overall grasp, that we lose access to what's behind the words. Another good example, I think, is something like the siren of a fire engine, for example. If you hear that, what's happening is you're not hearing individual tones and then through some kind of inference, a cognitive act, then deducing that, there must be a fire engine. That's what we think must happen, because we think of things in terms of assembly. But what's actually happening in terms of your experience is you hear the fire engine. You hear the siren of the fire engine first, and then you can break it up into individual tones afterwards if you want. The point is, it's a derivative secondary act. What you hear first is the siren of the fire engine, not a whole bunch of tones that you then have to make sense of. The other idea that comes out in that quote is that the idea is not layered on top of a sensible reality. It's not a second layer of psychic reality spread over the sensible. Ontologically, there isn't a reality first of meaningless sensory stimuli, sounds, sights, smells, whatever, over which we merely spread our meanings. This is immediately a dualistic way of thinking. And that tells us that it's abstract, that it's an abstraction, that it's derivative. We've missed something that was more originary. We've missed the prior truth here. Things, to be the things they are in the first place, are already imbued with meaning. There is no meaningless substrate on top of which we project a meaning. And it's a tempting illusion to think that that's the case, but that's because we approach things from we naturally, automatically detach from our actual experience because we think that's flawed. We think there's something untrue about it, and try and understand it from a third person perspective. But experience is fundamentally first person. You can't experience it, and you can't understand it if you detach and try and grasp it from a third person perspective, you're completely changing the thing you're trying to understand. So yeah, the thing is what it is only because it's already imbued with meaning. Okay, let me bring up this diagram that I promised I'd talk about to show the parallels between strict ideality and pure ideality. So you can see there in the middle column we've got strict ideality, in the right column pure ideality, and on the left we've got the common features between both. So if we just go down one by one, the sensible parts on the left, in strict ideality those are the musical notes. In pure ideality it's the words or the numbers. Then we have the sensible whole within strict ideality, and this is in relation to the little phrase, Swann's little phrase. So the whole there is that phrase itself. And in pure ideality, the whole, the sensible whole, is a sentence or the equation, depending on whether we're talking about language or math. Then the sense or the idea or the meaning, in strict ideality, it's the essence of love. That was the idea behind those notes. And in pure ideality, it's the concept that the sentence or the equation describes. So for example, flesh, gravity, superposition, whatever it might be. And we also talked about the abstract portrait, was what Merleau-Ponty called it. And this was the system of explicit relations between signs and signified. And with regards to strict ideality and Swann's little phrase, there was musical notation. And in pure ideality, it's language or mathematics. Okay, so let's turn to look now at reversibility in strict and pure ideality. So flesh we talked about as the dehiscence of the seeing into the visible and the visible into the seeing. It's the hinge, we called it, between the touched and the touching. And we also called this space that opens up there in which objects appear, we called that a clearing. With pure ideality, Merleau-Ponty is basically talking about a second kind of clearing. As there is a reversibility of the seeing and the visible, and as at the point where the two metamorphoses cross, what we call perception is born, so also there is a reversibility of the speech and what it signifies. The signification is what comes to seal, to close, to gather up the multiplicity of the physical, physiological, linguistic means of elocution, to contract them into one sole act, as the vision comes to complete the aesthesiological body. No locutor speaks without making himself in advance elocutory, be it only for himself. So there is quite a bit in that quote, and it is kind of an important one, I think. But again, we have a parallel between the strict and pure ideality and the way that the hinge appears in both. So as I did before, I'll explain it, and then at the end I'll throw up a diagram clarifying the connections or the parallels. So first, perception. If we take perception first, strict ideality. Perception is born at the intersection, the hinge, arising from the reversibility between the seeing and the visible. Fine, we talked about that in the last video. In this picture, vision understood in the deepest sense of that word as not just sensory data that we have an image of, we've converted in some way into an image, but what this object is, imbued with all of the meaning that makes the object that it is. So vision in this sense brings together all of the elements that belong to the sensible, generating the perception of this object, a song, a physical thing, whatever it might be. And when it does this, Merleau-Ponty says it completes the aesthesiological body. It's an act of completion, bringing to fruition, if you like, something that prior to this was merely inchoate. Then on the other side, pure ideality, instead of perception, we have signification. And signification also is born at the intersection, again the hinge, arising from the reversibility, this time not between the seeing and the visible, but between speech and signified. And in this picture, signification is what brings together all of the aspects involved in generating the perception of this object. And the reason I did the inverted commas there is because it's not strictly speaking a perception, because we're not perceiving anything, but it's the analog of that. It's a conceptual analog of that. And the same with object. The object is not a tangible or a sensible object, but it's something like a sentence or an equation. It's a sign. It's a symbol signifying something. And this completes what we might call the linguistic body, as opposed to the aesthesiological body in strict ideality. So then, what exactly is the second kind of intertwining? It's where Merleau-Ponty says, no locutor speaks without making himself an advance allocutory. In other words, in order to speak, I must be able to be spoken to, or perhaps be spoken about. However you understand that, you have to, the speaker must be able to become the object of speech. That's the idea. So there's that. That's what the reversibility is. It's between the active and the passive, the seeing and the seen. In this case, the speaking and the being spoken to, being spoken about, whatever it is, the subject versus the object. And importantly, even if it's only for oneself, Merleau-Ponty adds. So it doesn't matter whether one actually speaks aloud for someone else or whether you don't speak at all. Either way, it's still speech. It's still a part of language. And so the diagram then, the same diagram as before, just with some extra rows. So we talked about reversibility. With strict ideality, this was between the seeing and the visible, or the hearing and the audible, and so on. The other sensory modalities can be included in that as well. With regards to pure ideality, reversibility is between speech and signified. The intertwining, as far as strict ideality goes, it's the idea that to see, one has to also be visible, or to hear is to also be audible. With regards to pure ideality, it's to speak is to be allocutory. Like I said, in order to speak, I must be able to be spoken to or to be spoken about. Subject-object distinction there. And finally, the clearing or the hinge. With strict ideality, this was perception, and with pure ideality, it is signification. All right, so I've just got one more quote I want to give you, which contains a couple of ideas that I want to finish up on. When I think ideas animate my interior speech, they haunt it as the little phrase possesses the violinist, and they remain beyond the words as it remains beyond the notes. Not in the sense that under the light of another sun hidden from us they would shine forth, but because they are that certain divergence that never finish differentiation, that openness ever to be reopened between the sign and the sign. As the flesh is, as we said, the dehiscence of the seeing into the visible and of the visible into the seeing. So the first thing there, this idea of ideas lying beyond the words. The ideas in pure ideality, the ideas of the intelligence, inhabit my language or my mathematical equations in the same way as the idea, the essence of love, in the little phrase, inhabits the musical notes the violinist produces. That is, they remain beyond the words, not because they belong to a different, transcendent domain, shining forth from the light of a hidden sun, as Merleau-Ponty said in that quote, but because they are the framework that structures the words or the equations. They are the meaning, the sense behind them. And Merleau-Ponty in that quote also calls these ideas, in an interesting turn of phrase, the divergence, that never finished differentiation, that openness ever to be reopened between the sign and the sign. And it's worth thinking about this for just a little moment. So in the intersection then between speech and signified, we have the clearing of signification. And signification yields a specific sentence or equation. The idea or the ideas behind this and which determine it, however, rather than being fixed and singular, arise from connections made in between signs, which in pure ideality are symbols like words or numbers. And this ties in with what we said earlier, if you remember, about language, namely that it's creative and dynamic in a way that it can't be if it's a system of inert signs which unambiguously and univocally refer to singular significations, whose meaning they completely and fully contain. That's too rigid. It's too rigid and inflexible for what language is for us, which is it's creative. I forget the quote. I've used it earlier. He says something along the lines of my writing, my speech, my writing tells me what I think, something along those lines. But the idea is that you rather than having fixed ideas in your mind, which you just have to use language in order to communicate. So it's just a medium to try and transfer ideas from your head into someone else's. Instead of that, language is the way that you form your ideas. It helps you structure and even understand what it is that you want to say. It helps give birth to those ideas. So the process of writing, the process of speaking, it's a part of the formation of those ideas, the generation of those ideas. In the Prose of the World, Merleau-Ponty adds to this by following Saussure in holding that a language is less a sum of signs than a methodical means of differentiating signs from one another. And that brings us back to the quote where he talks about a never finished differentiation, a certain divergence. Difference is key here. Individual ideas aren't fixed, substantial, independent things. Rather, they are merely nodes, if you like. They are certain loci of intersection between different signs. As Merleau-Ponty said before, they are the integral of all the differentiations. So difference is the driving force behind ideas rather than The ideas they're not so much the islands that you end up on in a sea in a kind of passive sea. Rather, it's the sea itself, the differences between those nodes, those islands, that generate the ideas. So what's important is the difference. It's the sea rather than the islands themselves. The islands themselves just act as signs. I mean, so the islands are signs, but they act as, I don't know, like something like reference points, if you like. They're not the destination themselves, but they are like navigational tools, navigational points, which you use in order to grasp the relation between them. And it's the relations that are essential, that are what constitutes the ideas. So difference rather than identity is the important factor here. Really, really Deleuzian idea. If you've read Difference and Repetition, this will just make total sense to you, because it's exactly how Deleuze describes his metaphysical ideas. The other thing in that quote is that Merleau-Ponty says it's a never finished differentiation. And it's never finished because there are an infinite number of ways to differentiate between signs. You never run out of ways, of relations. You can run out of the individual signs themselves, the words, the terms in your equations, the numbers. You can run out of those, but you can never run out of the relations that can appear in between them. And it's that's that differentiating factor, and that is endlessly creative. There are an infinite number of possibilities associated with that. And this is the last thing we need to complete our diagram. So I've added one last thing there on the bottom, the left, the ideas, and these are in strict ideality, a never finished differentiation between signs, but in terms of the sensible. And in pure ideality, it's exactly the same, a never finished differentiation between signs again, but here it is symbols. Okay, awesome. So that's pretty much the end of this chapter. Merleau-Ponty did start the 5th chapter. He got about 7 pages into it, but all he really does is talk about method, the need, in particular, the need not to presuppose anything. Something that Deleuze makes a big deal of in Difference and Repetition, by the way. And he begins to talk about the presence of the thing, defining it as a node of properties or a principle of identity. Again, rather than being a fixed, substantial thing, it's more that we should think of it as kind of a collection of different lines, if you like, the intersecting point for a number of different axes. I think that's a good way to think about it, actually. Axes drawn between different signs generate intersecting points, and those intersecting points are what we call the things. So essentially he's questioning the plenitude and the positivity that we've traditionally invested the thing with. It's more a locus or an attractor, if you like, for certain qualities, for certain features, for certain properties, rather than being something in and of itself. Properties or features kind of gather at that point, and they are what is essential, rather than there being any kind of substantial thing underneath them. And what's particularly interesting about this is that This way of talking about things of Merleau-Ponty's as not substantial, as a node of properties, is how quantum physics is exactly the way that quantum physics talks about particles as well. It's going a bit off topic, but that's just an interesting parallel to note there. So let's have a look at a summary. First up, strict ideality. We discussed this a little bit more. Strict ideality refers to ideas in connection with sensible visibles. The big thing that we looked at in this video was pure ideality, and this Merleau-Ponty described as ideas of the intelligence, so essentially more abstract than the ideas in strict ideality, less connected, more tenuously connected to the sensible, so abstract concepts, mathematics, those kinds of things. However, Merleau-Ponty said that these ideas are not divorced from the sensing or the sensible. Instead of, they still have a connection, and through two different ways that we looked at. First, as a different kind of flesh, the flesh of language. So these ideas of pure ideality, they retain that flesh structure because this is how sense or meaning appears. Only instead of the flesh being the flesh of the body and the world, it's this more rarefied flesh of language or symbols. But it's still flesh, which means, like I say, that same structure carries over. And secondly, pure ideality is still anchored in the flesh of the body and the world. So in order for there to be any of this abstraction taking place, abstract thinking taking place, we must be anchored in the sensible. All of the abstract thinking that we do is grounded in the sensible. This is the one aspect of our realities that we just cannot avoid. We cannot escape. And it's the starting point for our entire existence. Thus we are, Merleau-Ponty said, emancipated in pure ideality, but not freed from these constraints. Pure ideality entailed a different kind of reversibility from the one we saw in strict ideality. The hinge here was between, instead of the seeing and the visible, was between speech and signified. And what the locus, the intersection between these two created was, instead of perception, created signification. And this connects us with a second intertwining as well, which Merleau-Ponty described by saying a locutor must be allocutory. In order to speak, one must be able to be spoken to or be spoken about. In order to be the subject of speech, the one speaking, one must also be able to be the object of speech. And it was important to know that this is irrelevant. It's irrelevant whether one actually speaks or not. The idea is that a locutor is someone engaged in a language, whether that language be words, whether it be through number, it doesn't matter. To be engaged in those, to be using any of those is to be speaking. And finally, pure ideality is a never finished differentiation between sign and sign, because ideas, rather than being primary and characterized by identity, rather than being what they are, arise out of differences between signs. not just arise out of differences, they are the differences between signs. It's the relations between the signs that is what the idea is comprised of. In a nice turn of phrase by Merleau-Ponty, the integral of all the differentiations. And that's it. We have come to the end. This was a tough video to make. It took ages to prepare as well. Man, you can't even imagine, but it's done. So let's put that one to bed. So pretty much all that's left to talk about is the next series. And the next guy I'm going to tackle is Derrida, actually, which may or may not come as a surprise to you. I have mentioned him a few times in this series, and some of the parallels in particular that have come up between him and Merleau-Ponty, which is already a good sign. If there's a parallel with Merleau-Ponty, I think there's something of value there. But anyway, that's what I found with Derrida when I was reading him. I started reading him expecting to not like him, and I really just wanted to find out why I didn't like him. I already didn't like him. I just had to know why. And the problem was, as I read him, the reasons for not liking him diminished, and the reasons for liking him increased. And so when I got to the end, it was like, okay, this guy has something interesting to say. And I've heard it said before, and I quite agree with it, and it applied to me before I started reading Derrida. I think a lot of people who don't like Derrida are people who've never read him. In fact, most people, I think, who don't like Derrida have never actually read him, just kind of throw him into this postmodernist, post-structuralist kind of box where everything's relative, there's no truth, there's no meaning, it's all whatever, it's all just definitions, it's all words defined with expressions that contain words that are all defined by other expressions, and it's a big circle and nothing means anything. To the extent that that's true of postmodernism, and it certainly is true of some kinds of postmodernism, some people in postmodernism for sure, not interested in that. But that is, although that's what I expected to find in Derrida, it's what I did not find actually. And so I really enjoyed reading him actually, and enough that I thought he's worth doing a video series on. So that's what's going to come next. I'm going to take a few weeks off though. I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks maybe before I get into him. But yeah, thanks for sticking with me through this series. I hope you got as much out of watching this as I did making it. Until the next one, until Derrida, then I'm signing out, and I'll catch you later.